Hello, everybody, and welcome to ConTinual. And tonight we're talking about 70s B horror films. And I have a wonderful panel with me tonight, and we're going to have a great time. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves, starting with Bill Mulligan.
Oh, hi. Thank you. I'm Bill Mulligan. I'm a high school science teacher, podcaster. One of my podcasts is about 70s movies, horror films, so they're all B movies. And I just had my first book, Realm, published by Falstaff Books. I'm heading off to Dragon Con real soon. I'll be able to finally have one of these in front of me at the panel and be able to drop things like, well, in my book, blah, 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 blah. So I can't wait.
That's great. Jessica?
My name is Jessica Nettles. I'm an educator as well. I teach English, the flip side of things. I do not have a podcast. That's something in the future. I do have a book with Falstaff, Children of Menlo Park. I write historical fantasy. I write Southern Gothic horror, and I love 70s B horror. Even though I'm kind of new to, I'm new and old to it, but I have lots of favorites and lots to talk about.
Great. Mark?
Hi, I'm Marc Abbott. I am also an educator. I teach creative writing / ELA English in high school. I have several published books, but the most recent would be Hell at Brooklyn T, which I wrote with Stephen Van Patten and Kurt Johnson, who I also share a podcast with called Beef, Wine, and Shenanigans. And yeah, I was born in the 70s, so I grew up with this kind of stuff. I love it.
Great. That's great. Seanan?
Hello, I am Seanan McGuire. I do not currently teach anything. I just write stuff. But I was a kid in the 1980s, so 1970s horror films were kind of 90% of my diet. And when Kenneth Muir, who is a scholar of horror film, decided to put out some review books, the horror movies of the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, I was the first person to write him a letter telling him that I had used his horror films of the 1970s as a checklist. So I do have a letter from Kenneth Muir saying, congratulations, but I think something may be profoundly wrong with you.
Wow.
Well, that is wonderful. And I'm Jeanne Adams, your host. I am sort of an educator. I teach a lot of classes on creative writing and plotting and body disposal for writers. So you can imagine that horror is right up my wheelhouse. And I love 70s B horror movies because, as you were saying, Seanan, that whole 80s vibe where it's the Saturday sleepover and all the horror movies are out. You know, you gotta watch a horror movie at a sleepover. So, you know,
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's fine.
The most confusing thing about 1980s horror movies when I was a kid, because they shifted so much into the modern teenager, was who are all these kids that are going out and having dates on Saturday nights? You could watch horror television from 7 p.m. until 4 a.m. on Saturdays. No one was leaving their house. You can tell I was not a popular child.
Well, you know, the 30s were kind of about the creature feature, and the 40s and 50s were creature features, and the Mummy in the 50s, and the 60s were really Hitchcock, right? Psycho. But when we get to 68, we get Rosemary's Baby. And then we start into what a friend of mine likes to call the Stephen King era. So what is your overall favorite 70s horror flick, the one that stands out to you as sort of the iconic 70s horror movie? Seanan, since you have the book, we'll let you start.
Well, the book is downstairs. So sadly, you said creature feature, and I jumped immediately to 1986. I am now on Critters. You're going to have to give me a second to think about things that were actually released in the 1970s.
Well, how about I come back to you, Jessica? Can you think of one that's...
I think it really depends on the part of the 70s you're really talking about. Now, I tend to linger in the early 70s because there's a major shift that happens in the 70s with horror. The first part of the 70s, you're dealing with more supernatural elements, and you're dealing with psychological horror a whole lot more, and some folk horror mixed in. So you've got a whole bunch of crazy stuff going on And then there's this shift that happens maybe about 73, 74, where we start shifting into slasher horror. We begin moving into slasher horror. And that's where I stop, because I don't like slasher horror. Sorry, guys. I like the supernatural stuff. I like the environmental horror, that kind of stuff. My personal iconic, I've got two, and really Rosemary's Baby kind of doesn't count because it's right on the edge. It was like, what, 68, 69?
68.
Yeah. It's probably Stepford Wives. It's very feminist. It's very much of that era. And I don't know, I just love that movie. And a lot of people say, oh, it's so silly. But there's some really, like, for me as a woman, some really kind of scary moments.
Oh, yeah.
Where it really speaks. And I'm like, there's some things it's pointing to that's kind of real, and it makes it scarier. For me, it does anyway. So it's, for me, it's really iconic.
In the 70s, you get sort of the body horror, like Night of the Living Dead and Stepford Wives and things like that. So you get the sort of thing of, do I own my body? Right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So always a little creepy. And those did seem to sort of slant more towards the early and mid 70s. Yeah. Mark, do you have a favorite that's sort of iconic 70s for you?
There are three. Dawn of the Dead. Which was probably I wouldn't say it was my introduction, because I had Friday the 13th was the 80s, but it was my first foray into cannibalism gore. That was extremely shocking for me as a kid watching that. The other one is the poster that you see posted behind me, Sasquatch. And this was actually the first monster movie my father took me to the theater to see. And I have so many fond memories of how this movie just kind of freaked me out. Unfortunately, it doesn't hold up if you see it now. And then The Omen.
Oh yeah.
Which I was not allowed to watch a lot of the supernatural films. My apparently, according to my mother, my father abandoned her in The Exorcist on 42nd Street. He'd actually told her he was going out for a cigarette and never came back. And she found him in the lobby with 15 other men chain smoking, who had been terrified out of their minds and couldn't go back into the theater. So they were very I don't know if your brain could handle it, but I love The Omen. That was my other one.
There is something so sinister about that movie.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
The camera positioning and the cutaways, some of the things in that are just so sinister.
Yeah.
Bill, what about you?
Oh, this is so hard. Favorites, because I go back and forth. It's like picking your favorite cat or child. Yeah. There are two that really stand out, and that what they both have in common is that they're European. So the 70s were when I really started discovering horror beyond American shores, and they're both very graphic. One is Lucio Fulci's Zombie, which I really like because it takes, by this point, Dawn of the Dead and Night of the Living Dead had completely reinvented the zombie into something almost more science fiction and introduced cannibalism. And Fulci kind of brought back the supernatural element. His zombies are not reanimated by a satellite from space. They're not a virus. They are just some horrible mistake. They're slow moving. If they moved any slower, they'd be moonwalking backwards. But to me, that's always been scarier. That the inevitability of them, the zombies don't get tired. So you can outrun a zombie. Anyone can outrun a zombie, but eventually you have to stop. You got to sleep, and the zombie just keeps on coming. Eventually he's going to get you. It's the perfect metaphor for death. The movie is stupidly graphic, and Fulci's a strange filmmaker. Sometimes beautiful shots, and then the zoom lens goes crazy. So he drives me nuts, but I find as time goes on, I appreciate his work more and more. I used to kind of diminish it. He wasn't one of my favorite. My favorite was Dario Argento. What's weird is as time goes on, don't like Dario as much, and I'm liking Fulcio more. But my other favorite from that time is a Dario Argento movie. It's a great one, Deep Red.
Oh,
Deep Red, which is just so stylistic and beautiful in its own way. I mean, my favorite movie of all time is Suspiria. Absolutely. It's my absolute favorite, but I could just talk about that forever. And I get tired of talking about Suspiria, how much I love that movie. But Deep Red has a lot of that quality too. It's just all style. Doesn't make a lick of sense. Not a lick of sense. I don't know what's going on, but it's gorgeous. And that's good because some of the violence is really awful. What happens to these poor people is terrible. He doesn't shy away from it, but somehow he's able to make it watchable and almost poetic. It's just very 70s. I can't imagine them doing it now. When they tried to do it, they remade Suspiria, and
a different movie.
Yeah, it's a very different movie. They really should have called it. They should have called it something else. I don't know why. Yeah.
Seanan, back to you.
Okay, so y'all are very serious and dark and deep. And I sat here and thought about what is actually from the 70s that makes me happy and is technically considered a horror movie. It was definitely horrific to my mother, who had to deal with me during the period where the only things I would eat were things I wanted revenge on. And that is Attack of the Killer Tomatoes.
Yes.
Dun, dun, da, 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 dun, 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 dun. I did Puberty Love for a second grade talent show, which is not a great idea. Again, not a popular child. If you want something a little more horrific, I'm a big fan of The Devil's Widow, which is an underrated, undersung Tam Lin adaptation.
Really?
Recasting the Queen of Fairy as Satan. It was originally released in England in, I think, 1970, 1971, and then it was recut and released in the States 2 years later. So the original title of the British cut is Tam Lin, and then the American cut is called The Devil's Widow. It is not a good movie, but my thesis was on Tam Lin, and so I have a deep and abiding affection for anything that plays in that space.
Did that have Roddy McDowall?
Yes, it did have Roddy McDowall in it.
Wow. Very cool.
It's interesting because one of my favorites is not technically, I mean, it's horror, but it's more leaning towards Hitchcock, but it's got that sort of Tam Lin element or like mystical element, is The Wicker Man.
Oh, yeah.
I love The Wicker Man.
And it's just so psychological, and you get to the end of it and you're creeped out entirely, but you're not exactly sure totally why you're creeped out, because a lot of it is very straight. Like they play it completely straight and you're like, but wait, that's seriously creepy. But they don't play it that way.
Well, and I think that's why it's creepy, though. I mean, for me, it speaks to me because I see, it's folk horror. So for me, it speaks to me because as a Southerner, there's a lot of elements that I see in that as a Southerner that's like, oh yeah, I can see that happening in my community, because I grew up in a small town community, and I'm like, oh yeah, I can see people kind of leaning into some of this belief structure and doing some of this stuff because, yeah, this is what they've always done. And I think that's why that's creepy, because people do what they always do because that's what they believe is right.
And they've always done.
That's what makes it creepy. That's what makes the lottery creepy.
Yeah.
Right.
The same thing.
Yeah. Well, Seanan, you actually got to my next question, which was the 70s were actually really famous too for some long-standing comic horror. Young Frankenstein, Rocky Horror. We're still, as a collective, going to see Rocky Horror and producing Rocky Horror. And why do you guys think that got so popular in the midst of, The Omen and Jaws and The Exorcist and Salem's Lot? Mark, what about you? What do you think?
I think because they were just different. I think the 70s experimented a lot with different types of comedy. We were rolling into an era of comedy where late 70s, early 80s in particular, comedy was pushing the envelope. There's a lot of that stuff you can't do now because people get oversensitive about it was genuine comedy. We were trying to spoof the things that were making us uncomfortable. And I think that we were just at a point in our lives where those type of films it spoke to that very bizarre half of you, particularly Rocky Horror. I didn't see Rocky Horror until years later. I never saw it during the 70s. I saw it late when I went to college in the 90s. And I remember the first time I went and I was like, what the hell is this? Because no one ever told me what it was. They were just like, oh, you have to see it, and then I kind of walked out of there like, why was okay, now I got it. Now I see what this was about. And it became one of my cult favorites. But I think it was something different and it stretched the envelope. And I think that's something people wanted.
I think Mel Brooks stretched the envelope with everything he did, and I don't think he could do any of it today.
Nah.
Especially not Blazing Saddles.
No.
Real.
That was
for real.
Or even High Anxiety.
I love High Anxiety.
I do too. And Young Frankenstein.
Underrated. Yeah.
Very underrated. Seanan, what do you think about the whole comedy horror?
Well, I think I have absolutely no firsthand awareness of what the cultural makeup was during the 70s. I didn't exist yet. I was just picking it up when it came to public, to public television. So I don't know why it happened. I do know that the 1970s were a fantastic time of comedic horror, as were the 1980s, as were the 2010s. I think that it is extremely reductive to say, oh, Mel Brooks couldn't do X or Y today, when what we are referring to is a specific parody of a specific genre of film at a specific time. You're right. He couldn't do that today, not because people are oversensitive, but because the source material is no longer available to laugh at.
True.
Airplane was such a successful parody of the airplane heist movie genre that it killed the airplane heist movie genre. It's dead
really
now.
did.
We only remember the comedy. And I think that horror comedy is so powerful and is so successful and ongoing because laughing when you're scared is a natural human response. About slightly more than a third of the population, if you frighten them, will start to giggle. And that actually plays against people in assault cases, in all sorts of actual legal trials, because, oh, no, she didn't say no. She was laughing. Right. If you scare me badly enough, I will just start to laugh. It's automatic. It is not something under my control. It's very frustrating. But people also make jokes about the things that frighten them to try and bolster themselves. No, the wolves aren't going to come out of the woods and eat me. The bears ate all the wolves long ago. Isn't that great? And again, natural human responses. Have you seen Slither by James Gunn?
Yeah.
That is definitely not a 1970s horror film. They used all the KY jelly in Canada. I'm very proud of them for that, for their devotion to physical effects. But there is a point about 2/3 of the way through the movie when the mayor of this small town that is under siege by alien zombie brainworms. It's basically what if we did Night of the Creeps with a modern setting and a higher budget. The mayor of this small town that is being devoured by space zombies is in the back of his car, and he opens his little fridge and there's no Mr. Pibb. And he completely loses it, like beating his fists on the car, shouting, "Where's my Mr. Pibb?" And that moment makes the whole movie more frightening. It's a comedy moment. It's a hilarious moment, but it's such a human moment that including that comedy means it is way more upsetting when the zombies come again, because they're always going to come again.
Right. It's a great point about the antithesis of, right? We don't do cowboy movies anymore, partly because of Blazing Saddles. And there are so many of those things. I mean, I think High Anxiety is probably not a genre per se, so I don't think that there's, that sort of thing. But this is something I hadn't thought about, and it's a very, very, very pointed thing. Jessica, what about you? What do you think about the comedy horror of the 1970s?
Well, I think the whole point of it being experimental, I think it's true. A lot of comedy at that point in time was experimental. You know, Saturday Night Live, all of that.
Second
we're
City,
experimenting. We're pushing that envelope. Rocky Horror is a good example. And I think the popularity, for instance, of Rocky Horror and its lasting value is the fact that it became such a cult thing because it became a rite of passage. I mean, almost all of us have had that rite of passage. It was a rite of passage for our generation, especially. Oh, you've got to go. You've got to go. And is it a great movie? Oh, hell no, it's not a great movie. It's a horrible movie. I mean, the only thing that saves it is Tim Curry, and that's because he's fabulous in everything. Yes. And he has great legs. The man has great legs. I would look at those legs forever. But it's not a great movie. The soundtrack's pretty good. And it is funny at times, but it pushes an envelope and it pushes on the whole. Once again, we're talking about pushing the envelope of something that's not there anymore. The serial stories of the 30s and 40s is what it's pushing on, or the double feature, right, that you got at the drive-ins, which we don't have anymore, right? It's essentially a story that would have happened in the 50s, only much cleaner, unless Ed Wood did it. Which is a whole other topic.
That's a whole other topic. It was such a rite of passage. I remember trying to explain to my father where I was going,
explaining it,
and what movie I was seeing and what it was about. And I'm like, it's a science fiction movie, Dad.
Yeah.
And
I didn't see it until I was much older, so there was no explaining it. I mean, how do you explain it to conservative parents? You don't.
You don't. I mean, you just say it's a science fiction movie. That's exactly what I did. Bill, what was your experience with it?
Oh boy, one of the things I think that really makes a comedy horror work, something like Young Frankenstein. When you watch it, it's obvious the people who made it loved the movies that they were lampooning, and that love makes it much better. Sometimes you see comedies where you feel like the people had contempt for what, like they were saying, look, we're making fun of something. Look how stupid it was. Make something else. Pick another genre then. We don't need that. It takes the funny away. Rocky Horror to me is just one of those lightning strikes once. It's unique. What really made it work, you're right, as a movie, it's not that great. As an experience, it was wonderful. And the experience was created by the audience. So this was, I think, really what made it work so much is that when you went to see it, you were part of the show. You were actually the most entertaining part of the show. Mm-hmm. And there was a sense of ownership that people took this movie and took it far beyond what even the filmmakers had done and made it an event. And it's one of those things, they've tried to do it since, and it never works. Even the sequel to Rocky Horror, you can't make a cult film. The audience picks the cult film.
Right.
That's right.
And they're going to get angry if you try to, this is a cult film. It's like, oh, we'll be the ones that decide that.
We'll be the judge of that.
Yeah. And usually no, because they didn't start out making that. It just became that. If you said, I'm going to make a cult film, I'm going to make an audience participate, no, I don't think the audience is going to go for it. They know when they're being manipulated.
Yeah.
Sometimes things just have to happen organically. So unique. Really fun. I remember the first time I went to see it, it was just such a blast. And the audience, you really do feel like a virgin there because the audience knows exactly when to throw the toast and you're just looking around. And then the next time you go, you're the one. Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is when we throw the toast. This is when we squirt the thing.
Wait, I was supposed to have toast?
Yeah. It's like the second year I went to Dragon Con. I'm walking around with my friends like, oh, let me lead you around. I'm like Gandalf. This is the place where they serve the giant slices of cake. Like I'd been there for one whole year and suddenly I was an expert.
The point about needing to love the thing that you're making fun of is very true. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which is well known as one of the most popular recent horror comedies, didn't land with me at all or with a lot of people I know, because if you read the book, it is fairly obvious that the author does not care for Pride and Prejudice.
Right.
The author is trying to make Pride and Prejudice interesting by adding zombies, and so does not think through the logical ramifications of zombies in that setting, does not think through the structural and societal issues that underpin Pride and Prejudice it's very my head is pasted on, yay. And the movie addressed that by actually enjoying both sides of its source material. So the movie, which is not quite as funny, is actually much better because it cares about both halves.
Yeah, I so agree with that.
Yes.
Well, one of the other things we got in the 70s were body horror movies that we hadn't seen a lot in previous things. You know, Jaws, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Salem's Lot. I'm not sure that's exactly, but Halloween too also was a kind of body horror. Why do you think the 70s were so ripe for, you know, that sort of kind of transition? It's the beginning of the slasher era. We really got more into slashers into the late 70s with Halloween and, you know, on into the 80s. But what do you think sort of kicked that off? Mark?
So I'm gonna have to speak from a territorial place. I'm in New York, and New York in the 70s was not a place you wanted to be. And I think a lot of those movies just spoke to its time.
Mm-hmm.
And one in particular, The Last House on the Left.
Oh,
which
yeah.
starts out in New York City in the seediness and the griminess, and I think a lot of those films were just mirror images of the time. Now, I can't speak to how the rest of the country was functioning because I mean, New York always seemed, if you left New York and went somewhere else and told people you were from New York, people were like, oh, I'm sorry, you know, it was almost like everybody knew. And so I think a lot of those films were just, some of it was commentary on its time, just
Mm-hmm.
the grittiness and the violence, the economic plight of a lot of places. I mean, Dawn of the Dead was about commercialism, you
Mm-hmm.
know, the fact that people die and the first place you go is the mall. You know, it was or they said this was the last thing people remembered being. So I think a lot of filmmakers were trying to capitalize on where we were as a society at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really an interesting take on it, because I was actually thinking that about Deliverance too, that it was
Mm-hmm.
such a movie of its time in the sense of how we felt about places and how we felt about connecting to those places that were completely different from our own. Yeah. Shannon, what do you think about those sort of body horror films like Jaws and even Alien, which is 79?
So I disagree with some of your classifications as body horror. A shark might bite half your body off is not body horror. That is fear for the body. Body horror is my skin is crawling. It's trying to come off of me. It's mutation. It's melting and warping and becoming something horrible and new. And that is actually a definition I argue about a lot, because people will try to tell me, oh, in this, a shark eats someone's leg. It's body horror. You'll like it. And I'm like, no, dude. In this, a man turns into a cockroach because he slept at the wrong Motel 6. That's body horror. I do think we did start to see a rise of body horror in the 1970s. It got more and more prevalent through the 80s and 90s. And part of that is, if you look at things like the environmental charts and the puberty timings, the 70s are really where we started to see the effects of antibiotics and hormones in meat and in the water moving into the general population. And it's not something that happens so overnight that everyone go, oh my God, the cats are suddenly green. But when every woman in your family for generations has hit puberty at 14, and suddenly the 11-year-olds are starting to hit puberty, that is something that you notice even if you don't register it. When the summers are getting longer and the winters are getting shorter, you may not have a day-to-day countdown, but you notice it. You notice that things are changing around you, and it's in a subtle, unsettling way. And I think a lot of the actual body horror of the 70s was subtle and unsettling because it was reacting to those environmental changes.
Mm-hmm. What would you say were some of the high points of those kind of movies? Which movies would you call out as being more body horror in that definition?
In the 1970s, I think some of the, not all of, but some of the anthology films managed it fairly well. Vault of Horror, I'm pretty sure. We had Willard. We didn't have Ben.
Yeah, Ben was in 72.
Ben was in 72?
Mhm.
Okay. The Brood. Definitely so. Human Experiments, I think, was in the 70s, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
That was another one of my favorites.
yeah, Piranha, weirdly enough.
Oh, yeah.
It is, again, Shark eats you rather than you become Shark, but Shark has become something new because of additives in the water. Up from the Depths.
Oh, yeah. Gosh, I'd forgotten about that one.
And to a certain degree, I'm going to say Phantasm, because Phantasm is about when you are dead, your body can be mutated and become horrible at the hands of the tall man.
That one freaked me out beyond compare. Yeah. Jessica, using either definition, what were some of your sort of body horror movies of the 70s that were highlights for you?
Well, I've been musing through all of this, and I'm kind of going off in kind of an odd direction. So,
we love odd directions. Go for it.
Yeah. So I've been thinking of things like Westworld, Night of the Lepus, which is like we have giant rabbits, so the rabbits have changed, which is a terrible movie, but I watch it anyway. DeForest Kelly with a mustache. You can't beat that. That's another mutation. Whole other mutation. But Westworld, where you're dealing with that look like humans, and then you've got that question of what is humanity anyway?
Yeah.
And is it coming after me? And then of course there's Future World, which is its lesser sequel. And it's the same question again: what is human and what is not, and how do we know the difference? So I like that kind of thing. I was thinking of another one, and it just fell in my head. So those are the two I was really thinking of, and there are probably some others that are floating around in my head. Let's see, Cat People. The remake of Cat People was 1980 though, wasn't it?
It was in the 80s, yeah.
Which is a shame because
My favorite line from that movie is, "We do not play with our food." Mother always said, "Do not play with your food."
With your food.
Bill, what about you? What are some that you think about?
When I think of body horror, I think of Cronenberg, which Sean had mentioned.
Of course.
I loved it. The 70s. He just took off. Started with Shivers, where he managed to make sexually transmitted diseases, combine that with parasites, and just absolute madness. Too low budget to really see the vision through. Then he made The Wonderful Rabbit, which is just crazy, but great. But The Brood, oh my God, The Brood is the ultimate body horror thing. You've got Oliver Reed, who's, when Oliver Reed is one of the most restrained parts of your movie, that you are just on another dimension. Oliver Reed is training people to turn their rage into physical manifestations. And Samantha Eggar is actually giving birth to these, I don't know what, little dwarf-like creatures that go out and do her bidding. You watch this movie and you don't need to be told Cronenberg was in the middle of a bad divorce. This is the ultimate divorce movie.
Wow.
Yeah. It's harsh. It's really harsh, and boy is it good. And then of course he just went on running after that with The Fly and Scanners. I mean, he just kept on going, and I think people looked
so good.
I think people looked at what Cronenberg was doing and realized you can have your gore, but you can use it in the service of a thoughtful movie. Critics always had a hard time with this stuff because it's like, well, this is really lowbrow, disgusting kind of stuff. But clearly there's an intelligence there. There's someone who is a gifted filmmaker. They were probably happy when he eventually abandoned all that and started making more legit films. But I still love his early stuff.
Can I throw one out?
Oh, absolutely, Mark. Please.
It's Alive.
Oh yes.
Yes.
Which was a very terrifying film, and the idea of You know, I think because between that and the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Yes.
Oh,
Which,
I was going to mention
excellent,
that. Yeah.
excellent.
I didn't sleep for several days after seeing that remake. The original bothered me, but that one, even to this day, I can only watch it in small doses.
Yeah, it always gets under my skin.
But the idea that the environment and these pharmaceutical companies had such a strangle, like the horrible things that were going on during that time period and the effects it was supposed to have, it did have on a lot of people. That was just, I always thought It's Alive was a sad movie more than it was, because you know it wasn't the child's fault. It wasn't his fault as to what it became. Yeah. And I always sympathize with the father, because it's like, in one hand, you would be, you know, what would you do in that situation? You know, that's your child.
Yeah. Well, it's horrifying on several levels for that reason.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's one I wanted to bring up. Okay. So those films all worked. A body horror that 100% did not work, but I still kind of love it. 1979's Prophecy.
I was thinking about
the giant mutated bear. That movie is such a misfire, and yet the scene where the kid is trying to run in his sleeping bag and gets slapped into a tree and feathers go everywhere. You just want to stand up and applaud.
Well, one of the things that struck me as I was looking through a bunch of the different movies trying to prepare for tonight was that there were also a lot of this sort of watcher movies, like The Hills Have Eyes and Amityville Horror and The House at the End of the Lane. And I wondered what y'all were thinking about, that still sort of stays in vogue. It hasn't gone out of vogue really, because there's still some of those around. What was it about things like Amityville that were so popular? Because House at the End of the Lane came first, and Amityville, I can't remember I can't see where I wrote it down now, but it was definitely a big hit. So, Jeanne, what do you think about the sort of house watcher kind of horror movies of the 70s?
I think that as we have gotten societally more and more distanced from the histories of the places where we live, we start to ask reasonable questions about what was there before us. One of the fastest ways to drop the value of a house is to say during the showings, oh, someone died here. If your house is more than 20 years old, someone died there. And even if it's not, someone died on every inch of land in this continent. Like when we came over here to colonize the place, we colonized a graveyard. And just because we hid the tombstones, that doesn't mean the bodies are gone.
Right.
And the lack of understanding of that history does put a lot of monsters in our closets. So I think that looking especially at an older house where you can reasonably say, yeah, someone probably died there. Someone almost certainly died in there. It's very easy and natural to start spinning the ghost stories and start spinning out these tales of terror around them. And it's nice to watch that happen to someone else.
Truly, it is.
And I think part of why they're so popular in the modern day is if you look at those setups, it's always family that can't afford it somehow moves into the Adams mansion, which they paid $80 for because it's haunted. You let me move into 1313 Mockingbird Lane, those walls can bleed all they want.
Yep.
The house can say, get out, and I will ask the house, what color wallpaper would you like in this room? One of my absolute favorite failed series of the last several years was the 1313 Mockingbird Lane modern Munsters adaptation that the Pushing Daisies and Hannibal guy, Brian Fuller did, where they recorded the pilot. They decided not to go to series, but they aired the pilot as a Halloween special. And there's a bit very early in when Marilyn first finds what will become 1313 Mockingbird Lane and goes into the house, and the realtor is trying to talk her out of it. And he says, you don't want this place. A serial killer lived here. We think there are still homeless people in the walls. And Marilyn's response is, well, they have a home now. And that is very appealing in these modern generations where home ownership is outside of almost everyone's reach. You don't have any security. The idea that if you're just willing to live with a couple of demons, you can have what your parents took for granted. Let's go.
It's all good. Mark, what are your thoughts?
I agree with her, and then I want to take it a step further.
Excellent.
Because Amityville was a real place.
Yes.
And for whatever godforsaken reason, people thought, because I mean, they had to shut the street down. They had to stop people from going over there because, yeah, I agree. Every place on this planet, somebody has died in it. But I think with Amityville, it was the sensationalism of what happened. That was like the extra step. Oh, everybody was murdered. And the guy said that something in the house made him do it. Now, I don't know if I would want to go to the house to find out exactly what it was that spoke to this guy and told him to do this. And I don't know why people would want to bother an entire neighborhood just to take pictures of this place. But I think a lot of that became sensationalism. It was just, it's a place I can actually go and see. Crystal Lake is not, it's a summer camp that was, they shot Friday the 13th. Yeah, and if you can find it and hang out there, that's great. But this was a physical place that people could go to. And I think a lot of people felt some kind of way where it's like, if I can get there and at least put my hands on it or touch it or get within 5 feet of it, I can absorb some of that, whatever it is. But I agree. I agreed. I think that that was also the other fascination. The fact that someone was able to get this house that they knew what they were told, horrible thing happened here. And they said, don't care. It's, it's under $100,000. I'll buy it, now.
It's a fixer-upper.
Yeah.
There it is.
HGTV says I can make it happen.
Absolutely.
Jessica, what are your thoughts?
Well, I remember the Amityville thing, and I can remember I was in middle school when Amityville came out as a movie, and I was not allowed to see it, but I remember the book being passed, the paperback being passed around in 7th grade. All of us were passing it around. And I also remember that Ed and Lorraine Warren were making the rounds on the talk shows.
That's right.
About the same time. They were on Phil Donahue. And of course, I watched Phil Donahue at that time. If I was sick, I was going to watch Phil and watch Ed and Lorraine talk about the house. And they were part of this whole sensationalism. You want to know why people were coming to that house? It was Ed and Lorraine. Because they were on TV talking about this. Because they were right in the middle of it, making all that dough. Oh, let's bring those folks in.
Yeah.
That's why there was that whole yah about that. That's why it became so popular. That's why people were drawn into the Amityville thing anyway. And as a whole, I think we are fascinated by our houses and the ghosts, that may or may not be there. I mean, that's why we go on haunted house tours, right? That's why we go to the city tours and listen to their ghost stories, at Halloween. We want to hear those things, whether we believe it or not.
Right. We want to touch the supernatural.
That's why we have jobs, right?
Right, exactly.
That's why we get to write fun stories, because people want that. They want those ghost stories.
Yeah, Mark talking about how Amityville is a real place. You could go there, you could touch Amityville. That is, at least for white people, something we have been doing for centuries. My actual degree is in folklore and mythology. Many of the places that are mentioned in the fairy tales and folk tales of Europe are real places. And you can go there and you can touch them. My thesis was on the Ballad of Tamlin. When I found out that Tamlin's Well from the ballad is a real thing, it really exists in a little town in Scotland called Cotterhaw. My friend Amal and I drove 3 hours through the Scottish Highlands to cross a cow paddy field to touch Tamlin's Well and eat the blackberries that were growing wild around it. Because we were like, fuck you, Fae Queen. We're going to taunt you today and see what happens. And that is that's like making jokes when something scares you. It is such a human impulse to go, oh, the ghosts are in this pot. Well, I'm going to look in the pot and nothing bad's going to happen to me. Oh, well, the Fae Queen comes here to steal her sacrifices. I'm going to go there and I'm going to steal the Fae Queen's blackberries, which are a close relative of roses. So really, I'm going to steal the Fae Queen's roses and nothing bad's going to happen to me. I can't speak to anyone other than the Europeans, but the white people, you dangle the possibility of a brutal murder where all our skin is removed in a single piece by a supernatural entity in front of us, and we are going like a cat after a laser pointer.
Well, you get it too. It's so funny because I live near DC, and people go still to this day. Mm-hmm. Exorcist, it was in 1973.
Yep.
People go to the Exorcist steps all the time to take pictures. And it's now closed, but there used to be the Exxon gas station, the Exorcist steps, and the car barn, which is a historic building for the old trolley cars, right? But it's this narrow slice that they shot and fogged up for the movie. But there's a gas station right there. So it's not like beautiful. And it's really honestly not very spooky, except in the atmosphere that they created. But I agree, Shauna, and it's like, especially for those of us who are creative minds, what would happen? What's there? Can I touch it? It makes me think of the Fluffy guy, the comedian, does this whole thing about the crocodile hunter, and I'm going to poke it with a stick. It's like, we're going to poke it with a stick. Bill, what are your thoughts?
I was just thinking, boy, if a cosplayer had known you were going to that well, they could have had some great mischief right there. If there is one movie that did not scare me, it was Amityville Horror. Literally the only part that even made me a little nervous was when the guy couldn't find the check, because I've been there. That
it stole his money.
Yeah. The ghosts do not frighten me in the least. I'm sure if one jumped out at me, I have a heart attack and eat my words in my last remaining breath, but they just don't scare me. And I felt bad for the people who had the house, but I also felt like they're missing a good opportunity. If by some miracle, my house somehow gets on TikTok as a haunted house and people are showing up at the door wanting to come in, they slip me a $5 and they're welcome to come on in and look around, poke around. They're like, hey, this is kind of untidy. It's like, well, that's the ghost. I mean, I put my clothes in the hamper, but the ghost just
very neat, very
wampus everywhere. Yeah. And, whatever. I had a neighbor across the street who lived in the same town as Ed Gein.
Ooh.
Oh, wow.
And boys would take their girlfriends out to his barn, to show them the place. This is where the cannibal lived and everything. And just to give them a good scare. And the folks burned it down. They got tired of people coming in. I'm like, you morons, this place is a nothing town. Literally, this is the biggest thing that ever happened to you. You could have turned it into a Halloween destination.
Sideshow.
Oh, yeah. I mean, is it tasteless? Yeah, sure, but that's not a problem.
This is America. Of course it's tasteless.
And this is America. And America is a place when if someone hands you the opportunity to make a pile of money, it is immoral for you to say, no, I want to just...
I value my privacy more.
Yeah, I want to grow potatoes on my dirt farm or something. I don't want to have tourists coming in. Every year, Chapel Hill, by the way, has a big parade for Halloween. And every year they try to keep people from coming because they don't like thousands of people coming in spending money. I don't understand it.
Baffling.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our time together, but I wanted to check with y'all and see what's a movie we haven't talked about. What's a favorite that we haven't talked about that you were thinking, wow, we're going to talk about that tonight. What did I miss? Shauna?
I do feel like we have, by and large, skipped over the anthology films, which were still a big deal in the 70s. Vault of Horror, Trilogy of Terror. The idea that you could take a 30-minute scare and tie it to 2 other 30-minute scares, and suddenly it's a movie and it's something you can market, was very popular. And that really did kind of harken back to those serials and to the EC horror comics, to all of these things that taught us that fear is sometimes better in a bite-sized dose. You know, fear is a lot like an Oreo. The first Oreo tastes amazing. It doesn't matter whether you're on a diet or not. It is the perfect balance of crispy cookie and squishy inner filling, and it's just fantastic. The second Oreo never tastes as good.
But you keep eating them.
But you keep eating them. So the first scare in a movie is always fantastic. And then the second scare falls a little flat. So they have to make the third one way bigger, and you desensitize. Taking us into that anthology format, lets us have an Oreo and then a slice of cheesecake and then a scoop of sorbet rather than just 3 cookies with diminishing returns. And now I want a cookie.
Yes.
Sounds good.
Darn it. Now I want an Oreo. Mark, what are your thoughts? What did I miss?
2 very, very well-made vampire films.
Ooh.
Actually 3. Blackula.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's actually on my list. 72.
Wonderful film.
Yep.
72.
Wonderful.
Frank Langella as Dracula.
79.
Yes.
Which was beautiful. And Klaus Kinski reviving Nosferatu.
Yes.
which was he himself, Klaus, was just a creepy individual altogether.
Oh, awful human.
So and yes, he wasn't but all 3 of those vampire films, I mean, they kept that spirit alive. And I think, even with Salem's Lot, where which pays I always felt that they paid homage to Nosferatu with that Barlow look. Those are the ones that, I mean, vampires still existed. They things come and go, but somehow the vampire still, even Christopher Lee, Dracula 1972 AD. So.
Yeah. I'd forgotten about that one. Yeah. Jessica, what did I miss?
Well, we didn't talk a whole lot about television. There was a lot of horror on television, particularly in the early 70s.
Dark Shadows.
And of course, my favorite, Kolchak, The Night Stalker. And there were 2 really great movies, not just the series, but 2 very good Night Stalker movies that are available. You can find them actually on YouTube. And I need to mention this. I just have to mention this. There's actually a YouTube channel called Newcastle After Dark that features 70 horror, and it's all free. You can go and look at it. And that's where I've discovered a lot of titles I've never heard of and really upped my game with all of this. But no, Kolchak needs to be mentioned. He's like one of the big deals of the 70s, I think.
Yeah. We didn't talk about TV. There were so many movies. When I started looking at all the movies, there were so many movies.
Oh, yeah, for real.
And other than Salem's Lot, we really didn't talk about Carrie or some of the others.
Right.
Or the horror literature of the 70s. That could be a whole nother show. Bill, what did I miss?
There's so much. One of the things I do for gruesomemagazine.com is Decades of Horror of the 1970s. I think we're almost up to 200, I think, films that we've done. Yeah. Kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel now, but there's still a few gems that show up now and again. What I like about the 70s, we were seeing kind of the death, sadly, of the Gothic, the Hammer movies, and the more modern stuff was coming along. And there's this period where people are still trying to tell an old-fashioned kind of movie. So there's one I have just a wonderful fondness for, terrible movie, The Mutations, also known as The Freak Maker. And it's got Donald Pleasance as a mad scientist. It's just the classic scientist thing where he has somehow figured out how to turn a human into a Venus flytrap. Yeah. Genetic technology that is so far beyond anything else. It's like, I just think of that one meme where the guy's like, I'm going to turn people into dinosaurs, and Spider-Man saying, with that technology, you could cure cancer. It's like, I don't want to cure cancer. I want to turn people into dinosaurs. So we've got this ludicrous Venus actually, it's a great costume. This Venus flytrap man running around killing people. The gore is off the charts. We throw some freaks in there too, where they have a sideshow thing going on. So we get to see actual human oddities as characters. Boy, this movie's a mess. It's all over the place. An old-fashioned idea, but it's got nudity. It's got gore. Donald Pleasance is just wonderful. That man must have really needed a paycheck because he was in some stinkers. But he always brought his A game, Yeah, he knew this movie was not going to win him any Academy Awards, but he still is acting his little heart out. And I just love stuff like that.
That was one of the other things that struck
trying to make
me
a good movie.
That Pleasance and Donald Sutherland were in a ton of movies.
Oh, yeah.
Right. It's weird. I mean, some people like Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee kind of got typecast, so they were always excellent, but they were pretty much fated to be in horror films. But sometimes you see an actor who had some renown, and they're in this, and you're like, what's the deal? Did you need the alimony check? Were you in Europe and you decided they'll pay for my vacation? No one's ever going to see this. Those folks had no idea, you know. Oh,
and the one Walken.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
and
yeah.
one more that just came to mind. I can't believe I didn't mention Dr. Fives.
Yeah,
Dr.
definitely.
Fives.
Both
Yeah.
of those.
They're wonderful.
Sadly, we miss one of my favorites by this much in both of its original opportunities. Day of the Triffids, the movie was released in 1962, so it doesn't count. And then the TV series was 1981.
Yeah.
Like, it was probably filming in the 70s, but
Well,
that's
let's count it then.
Yeah, okay.
We totally count it.
I love
Day of the Triffids. It's based on the book by John Wyndham, classic British science fiction. What if all the plants decided to beat the living crap out of all the people? Wouldn't that be fascinating?
It's so good.
And it's
so
kind
good.
of in Little Shop of Horrors, Invasion. That's
Yeah.
actually one we never mentioned, was Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
No,
I
I brought
actually
it.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, he
Mark
mentioned it. He mentioned it.
Okay,
It's so
I think
creepy.
you may have brought that in when my kitten was attempting to climb one day.
Yeah.
Right.
She was-
right.
There have been various cat opportunities here. If
Yeah.
you saw the giant ass calico I was holding at one point, that
Yeah.
is my 9-month-old kitten.
My
What?
goodness, that's a large one.
Is she a Maine Coon?
Yes, she is a Maine Coon.
There you go.
She is not only a Maine Coon, she is a genetic chimera who absorbed her brother in the womb and appears to have taken this as a sign that she should be a horror movie sized cat.
Well, that's a horror movie premise right there.
There you go. Exactly.
9 months old, she weighs 17 pounds, and at one point she attempted to climb up my leg with all of her mini claws.
Oh my goodness.
Ouch.
Well, the Invasion of the Body Snatchers is actually one of the ones that scared the bejesus out of me. That one I could only take in small doses. And the only horror movie I've ever walked out on is Werewolf in London. I did the Exorcist thing that you were talking about, Mark. I walked out. I was like, I had a past life with this. I'm out. Well, we have come to the end of our time. This has been great fun. Let's go around the room and tell everybody where we can find you on the web. And if you have a new or recent release or upcoming one, give us a shout about that. Let's start with you, Jessica.
You can find me at jessicanettlesauthor.com. You can find me on Facebook, on that thing called X sometimes, on Instagram, on probably some other social medias that I can't think of right now because there's so many of them right now. My latest release was League of Monsters. I have a short story, speaking of monsters, in that anthology. This is an anthology where monsters that resemble the Universal monsters fight Nazis.
Excellent.
I love it. The next place I'm appearing is at Dragon Con. So if you want to come see me at the Falstaff room, because I'll be there.
I'm so jealous. Shauna?
So my latest release is in about 2 weeks, and that is Sleep No More, the 17th book in my October Days series, which is, the series that is bringing me into a slow boiling war with every publicist associated with DAW, Astra, or Penguin Random House, because they keep trying to say, this is a great entry point. It is not a great entry point. Please do not read book 17 if you have not read books 1 through 16. Please. You will just wind up emailing me mad because the book made no sense at all and I wasted your time. And most of you cannot spell when you are calling me horrible names because you read a book that was clearly labeled 17, but you had heard someone say good entry point. The people who say good entry point are lying to sell books. I am telling you the truth to sell books. Pick up Rosemary and Rue. That's book 1. That will make sense. Woo. And the next place that you can find me is this coming weekend. I will be at CocoCon in Phoenix, Arizona. So that should be good. I'm going to have to find out if anyone on the ConCom is affiliated with Leprechaun, which is another Phoenix area convention, and is the one that has added guest of honor is not permitted to leave the hotel unescorted to its official convention contract because I wandered off into the desert and came back with a Gila monster.
As you do.
I mean, it makes sense to me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mark?
You can find me. My website is whoismarkabbott.com. You can find me at the same place on Instagram and Facebook. I do not remember my Blue Sky, but I'm there. And I'm actually in the midst of writing a couple of short stories for some anthologies, one which has a Kickstarter now that came out a few weeks ago for the name of the book is called The Chaos Clock. And it's a collection of stories that are both cosmic horror infused with steampunk. So this I'm looking forward to being a part of that.
That's awesome.
And I will be at Multiverse in Atlanta, Georgia in October.
Awesome.
I will be at New York Comic Con, although I'm not going as an author, I'm going as Lord Voldemort.
Excellent. Bill, where we can find you?
I got to ask, did you get to keep the Gila monster?
No, they are endangered, so I had to put him back. But when I came back into the hotel after my unplanned excursion into the desert, I found the entire ConCom gathered in a circle talking about what they were supposed to do now. And I asked what was going on. And they said, well, our guest of honor wandered off into the desert to die. And I went, well, that's too bad. Wait, you're here. Yes, I am. And look, I have a friend. You can't have that. I do, though, but you can't. But I do. And that turned into a 5-minute who's on first routine as they kept trying to explain to me that it was literally impossible for me to have wandered into the desert and come back with a 2-foot long irritated venomous reptile.
Yeah. They're so pretty.
They just don't know you.
Gorgeous animals. Well, so my book is available on Amazon, and it is an excellent entry point because it's literally the only thing I've had published so far. So really, I can't think of a better one to start with. And you can also find me at billmulliganbooks.com. That's right, books, plural. Ha ha. I'm thinking long term. And Decades of Horror, thegruesomemagazine.com has the Decades of Horror 70s and 80s. And if you love this kind of stuff, we pick a movie a week. We just did Kingdom of the Spiders, and we're about to do Alligator. So, you know, there's still some gems out there. Yeah.
Well, that is fabulous. And I'm Jeanne Adams, your host. You can find me at jeanneadams.com on most social media as Jeanne Adams and here on ConTinual. And we look forward to talking with you next time and seeing all y'all again. Thanks so much.